Bonsoir, bonsoir. Bonsoir, bonsoir. I'm Marie-Monique Steckel, and I'm the French Institute Alliance Française, we call it FIAF, president. And it is my great, great pleasure to welcome you tonight to an amazing evening with Dr. Gregory Heberg, who just told me that he has not only a BA, but also a PhD of the Institute of Fine Arts, and so he knows everything about Degas and the Little Dancer. For those of you who are first here in our theater at FIAF, I would like to tell you that there's lots to learn about what we do here, and I hope you come back to an open house tomorrow night from 5:30 to 8 to have a taste of our year to come. Like me, I'm sure that many of you are eager, very eager, to learn more about the great Degas danseuse, and I am sure that we will have explanations that we've never heard before tonight. The lecture series kicks off, Dr. Heberg tonight, then continues throughout the week, and we have 3 more talks. I hope to see many of you again here, and I want you to welcome Dr. Heberg with me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I on? Let's see. We can dim the lights now, I think. Thank you. So thank you, Marie-Monique, for that kind introduction. One of the things I like about being an art historian is that the key original documentation is visual. If this was a lecture in the Civil War tonight, you just have to take my word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. Tonight, you all have 2 eyes, you have a brain, you can see the visuals on the screen and make up your own mind about whether this thesis makes sense or does not. First, let's just start with a few facts that we know about Degas' Little Dancer. The wax, the original wax, that's on the screen, is in the National Gallery in Washington. It was begun by Degas in 1878. He worked on it off and on for 2 years, and then in 1880, for the 5th Impressionist exhibition, he planned to show it with a number of works of art. The vitrine arrived, the wax never arrived. There's some jokes made about Degas never being such a perfectionist, he could never finish things. But upstairs, for the first time in history, we have assembled, with photo reproductions, all of the works that Degas intended to show in 1880 with his Little Dancer, because he planned to relate them to various works. A year later, in 1881, for the 6th Impressionist exhibition in Paris, the vitrine arrived on time. Again, the wax was 2 weeks late, as Degas was finishing the final details. And finally, the wax arrived. So the wax that you see on the screen, which actually we know was shown in 1881 in the 6th Impressionist exhibition, received a huge amount of critical attention. Degas then took the wax back to his apartment. In 1903, he had a 3-story apartment in Paris. In 1903, Mrs. Havemeyer and Mary Cassatt came to visit him. And Mrs. Havemeyer, the famous New York collector, she already owned 60 works by Degas. She wanted to buy the Little Dancer. She saw it in a vitrine in his apartment, and she wanted to buy it. And Mary Cassatt encouraged her. That summer, Degas proposed, because the wax had blackened and he wasn't sure about the internal structure, he proposed a plaster or a bronze of the wax to Mrs. Havemeyer. She wrote back, no, I want the original wax. Degas then took it up to his top-floor studio. This is all recorded by various people who saw it there, and he began to rework it. He told Villard, his dealer, that he was finishing the Little Dancer for Mrs. Havemeyer for 40,000 francs. He asked his friend, the sculptor Bartolome, about repairing the Little Dancer for a trip to America. But up until now, we don't know what Degas did when he took it up to his studio and reworked it. After he died, Mrs. Havemeyer again wanted to buy the wax. She sent Mary Cassatt to see it, and Mary Cassatt sent Mrs. Havemeyer a telegram in New York saying, statue, bad condition. His biographer, Paul Lafont, wrote in his 1919, after Degas died, how the Little Dancer was relegated to a corner of Degas' studio and was a ruin. Joseph de Honorel also said it was in poor condition. So something had happened between 1903 and then after Degas died. After Degas died, they tried to sell the original wax for about 3 years, but it didn't sell. They had 3 photographs taken by the photographer who only know his name is Gautier. This is the first time Degas' wax was ever photographed. We have no photographs from 1881 or before 1919, after Degas died. As I said, they tried to sell the wax. That didn't happen. And so in 1921, they cast a plaster on the right, actually 2 plasters from the Little Dancer. One is in the National Gallery in Washington. The one on the left is in the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, Nebraska. From that plaster, Heberg then cast some 29 bronzes of the Little Dancer. One example is on the right. And this is the first time you're seeing these works without tutus, without hair ribbons. The Joslin plaster, thanks to Kate Johnson and people at and Arthur Beale, who flew out, they removed the tutu, they removed the hair ribbons. We took 140 detailed photographs of that plaster. In the disc at the back of the book are 56 of them. So we now have this visual documentation of what Degas' wax looked like after he died, because that plaster records it exactly as it is after he died. And then this Heberg bronze on the right is in the Sainsbury Art Collection. Professor Greenow, the director, kindly took off the tutu, the hair ribbons, and they photographed 12 photographs of their Heberg bronze without a tutu. So you're seeing the Degas' Little Dancer unveiled. So what are the mysteries? Well, first, one mystery is that the bodice on the wax today is yellow, and it's very fancy. It has fabric-colored buttons, real buttonholes. But all of Degas' works from around 1880 show little dancers, little apprentices at the opera. They always have a white bodice and a white tutu. Well, Degas changed his mind. Well, in 1881, Heisman and this reviewer for the Saturday Review in 1881 both said the Little Dancer had a white bodice. So why did it go from white to yellow? I think, well, it faded. In 2010, this new book came out from the National Gallery, wonderful book. Daphne Barber and Shelley Sturman, they concluded that the wax on the Little Dancer bodice is pigmented yellow wax. It's not wax that yellowed over time. It was originally yellow. So it has a yellow bodice, unlike one would expect from that period, a white bodice. Also, the bodice doesn't fit at the back. This is the Joslin plaster on the left without the hair ribbon, so you can see the back. This is the Volswani bronze. I might point out that some details on the bronze don't match up with the plaster. I was amazed when I first started this research how, going through the Witt Library in London, the variations among Degas, the same model, all the different bronzes. And Joseph Czestochowski, his authority in Degas sculpture, said they really should be labeled, the Heberg bronzes, Degas and Palazzolo, because he did the caster for Heberg, because he did a lot of changes in the casting wax. As you can see, right, that isn't there. But that's the bronze cast from that plaster. Anyway, the bodice, back to the bodice, it really doesn't fit from the back. It's kind of, it was actually a commercially made bodice that was put onto the wax after Degas finished the torso. This is a drawing in the Morgan Library, and Degas scholars have concluded this is probably one of Degas' final versions for his Little Dancer, because it has this pointed thing at the bottom. You'll notice this deep décolleté on Degas' drawing, whereas on this is again the Joslin plaster without a tutu, the bodice is much higher than on Degas' drawing. Another little puzzling. So the bodice presents a bit of a puzzle. And Suzanne Lindsay, another Degas expert, she said that the bodice on the wax today does not correspond with contemporary documentation. They said it was a working tutu, or working bodice, and it's a very fancy, the bodice is actually cotton file. It's very much like, for a long time they thought it was silk. So a silk bodice, or almost silk bodice with fabric-covered buttons, that's not exactly what a 14-year-old opera would be wearing. The other mystery is the very thin legs on the wax today. I mean, her upper arms are about the same size as her lower legs. And you kind of expect some, an opera, having been constantly training, they'd have more muscular legs. On the right is a wax by Degas in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. that Richard Kendall, a Degas scholar, pointed out is unquestionably a revisitation by Degas of his little dancer in later years. Well, there you can see how thick her legs are. We don't have any photographs of Degas' model, Marie van Gotem, but we do have photographs of her sister, Louise Josephine, and you can see her sister has rather, the arms compared to these rather, this is her sister there, those rather thick legs. This is her sister again, thinner arms, thicker legs. I mean, that's the kind of thing you would expect. This is not a big mystery, but it's a little puzzling that the legs are so thin. Now it gets more complicated. Most people don't realize that on the original wax today, this hair is brown wax tooled to look like real hair. This is actually a wig stuck into the back of her head, hanging down the back. So this is brown wax hair, and this is a wig. The wig is now covered with brown wax, but in places where it's cracked and you can see through, conservators have determined that the wig underneath is kind of a blonde wig, near blonde they call it, and very thin human hair. And here you can see it on the back. It's a very elaborate kind of hairdo. The puzzling thing is, in 1881, when Heisman wrote about the little dancer, he said there was a wig at the back that was made of horse hair. Well, now it's thin, blonde human hair. And in 1903, when Mrs. Havemeyer saw it in Degas' apartment, she recalled how this wig was dark and woolly, how dark and woolly the hair was. Well, the hair is blonde. But the real puzzling thing is, actually, when I presented a paper on this at the Institute of Fine Arts in 2010, and people afterwards said, Greg, this makes a lot of sense. I said, how could he possibly have changed the wig on his, I mean, it's impossible. It must be embedded into the wax. He couldn't have taken it out and put in a different wig. Well, in 2010, 6 months after I gave my talk, this was published by the National Gallery in Washington. It's an X-ray of the original wax. And there is a big hole in the back of the head. And when I showed this to Dick Stone, head sculpture conservator at the Metropolitan Museum, he said, Greg, those wires have been cut. Now, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to think that, I think at one point Degas pulled out something, cut the wires, and added something else. The National Gallery has determined that the present wig, this near blonde human hair wig, was inserted into a hole in the back of the head, and the top of it was wrapped in a silk ribbon and stuck into this hole, and then they kind of squeezed it around the end to hold it in. I mean, at the very least, it would have been very easy to change the wig, because there's a big hole in the back of the head. The next mystery, this also was published in 2010. This, for a while, I was director of the New York Academy of Art. We had an active sculpture program. The first thing, I actually learned this in high school, if you do any sculpture, you put your central armature in the middle of your figure. And Degas worked out his figure with drawings, a preliminary clay. But look, this central armature inside the original wax little dancer is almost sticking out of her right hip and way inside the left. Now, at one point somebody said it would be impossible for him to change the armature and go inside and move it around. No, I mean, Dick Stone and Arthur Beale, the chairman emeritus of sculpture conservation, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, who's been a tremendous help with all my research. He said, no, you can just move wax from this side of the figure and add it to the other. I mean, wax is malleable. Even years after something's finished, you can melt it, move it around. Well, this is kind of a mystery. And one of the, when we did this, the other mystery is the condition of the work after Degas died. One of the surprising things when this photo was taken of the bronze in the Sainsbury Art Center are these bits of metal sticking out in the crotch area. And I showed it to Dick Stone and Arthur Beale, and it's not spurs from casting. It's like some kind of an armature, some things coming out of the original wax. After Degas died, Lemoine wrote how Bartolome, Degas' sculpture friend, removed some bits of recalcitrant iron that was sticking out of the wax. Well, this would have been covered by a tutu, so he didn't remove these little bits, but he removed, apparently there's bits of iron sticking out somewhere else, which again suggests something happened, something had been reworked. And this, I'll leave it for your visual eyes. This is a detailed photograph of the Jocelyn plaster showing the buttocks, what it looks like today. I mean, this is what it, recording the wax in 1920, 21. These are the hands. Now, people have said, oh, well, Greg, I think the wax just melted. Well, the little dancer wax is made of beeswax, which doesn't, it's 140, 150 degrees Fahrenheit before it starts melting. And as Elliot Goldfinger, another person who's been tremendous help with this, pointed out, they're not drip lines on the wax. And other waxes from Degas from the 1870s have survived in perfect condition. And the other thing is this shoulder on the, this is the wax today. This is the line of the shoulder. This is the line of her proper right arm. They don't match up. Here's the plaster. Again, this is the line of the shoulder. This is, you go to the Metropolitan Museum, they have one of these Heberg bronzes cast from this plaster. And there's a dislocated, you can see her right arm is dislocated. I mean, something happened. It was pushed back, or maybe it was reattached later, but it's not the way it was in 1881. And the final mystery, in 1881, I'll catch up with myself here. In 1881, Heisman wrote that Degas' Little Dancer was the only truly modern attempt I know of in sculpture. This has been quoted over and over and over again. And Nina de Villard said, but let the artist be assured, the work that is misunderstood today will perhaps one day be in a museum respectfully regarded as the first formation of a new art. And what's so revolutionary about this wax? Well, one thing, it wasn't that it was a realistic wax. Most people think, oh, this realistic, that was so, I mean, Theodore Reff, a great Degas scholar, and Richard Kendall, another one, they both pointed out wax figures with real hair, whoops, real hair, real eyes, this is a wax from 1806. It's in the Westminster Abbey. You go into Westminster Abbey, it's filled with these realistic waxes. There was Madame Tussauds, there was votive figures in Italian churches. They used to be filled with figures with real hair and real wax. In the salons in Paris, the academic salons, they showed wax figures with real hair and real wax. Heisman, who said this is a formation of a new sculpture, he referred to other examples of realistic wax figures with real hair, real clothes, so that was not what was new. And the subject matter wasn't so shocking. I mean, if you think about it, people, oh, well, she was going to become a prostitute. Well, Manet, Luncheon on the Grass, 1864, and the Olympia on the right, that was shown in the salon, the academic salon in Paris in 1865, 15, 16 years before. And that's a real prostitute. I mean, Aiken's The Gross Clinic was shown in 6 years before. I mean, it wasn't a shocking subject matter, a little dancer up on a train. So what was so unusual about it? That's the sixth and probably the biggest mystery. The answer comes from this amazing plaster that revealed, and Walter Maybaum helped get it to America, thanks to him and his wife. This plaster was turned up at the Volswani foundry. I won't go into the provenance and all of that. I'll just say that it helped solve these six mysteries of the that I just outlined. The biggest difference between it and this is the Jocelyn. So this plaster was cast after Degas died, and my thesis is this plaster was cast before Degas reworked it, before he took it up to his studio and reworked it for Mrs. Havmeyer. Casting plasters from waxes has been going on since the Renaissance. It's like taking a photograph today. It wasn't that big deal. They took 2 plasters after he died, and they took 1 before his reworked, and it survived in his, that's the provenance is in the book, but we know, we have a very good idea of how it eventually got to the Volswani foundry. But the biggest difference is that level shoulders, level hips, the weight is on both feet. Here, it's a contrapposto pose. The weight is here. The hips aren't level. And, it's got more movement to it. This is very stiff and static. Of course, at the time in 1881, people talked about how the stiffness of old age and how tough it was. Let's focus on the bodice. The first thing we did, actually Richard Kendall's suggestion, we sent the plaster up to Boston in 2007 to the MFA in Boston, where Arthur Beale and others evaluated it. And Meredith Montague, head of their costume textile research department, concluded that the plaster records an original wax that had a muslin bodice on it. These strips of muslin with these, buttons made out of little balls of wax. And again, this is a cotton file, very fancy bodice that's yellow. We don't know the color, of course, that this recorded, but it recorded a bodice that in 1881, Nina de Villard said the bodice was made of couture, which is kind of a muslin-like fabric. I mean, this is the kind of fabric that this critic in 1881 recorded. So that may explain, help explain this odd bodice. The other thing is you can actually see the slide isn't quite clear enough, but you can actually see the outline of the muslin fabric on the bodice, and these simple balls made of the buttons made of balls of wax. But the big difference is the back, and I urge you, the plasters now, for the first time in public view upstairs, to take a careful look at the back. This is beautiful tooling. When Claire Vincent, curator of sculpture, Degas sculpture at the Metropolitan Museum saw this, she said, oh, these tool lines are pure Degas. Look at how carefully he fitted it to the back of his figure. This is not carefully fitted. This is a commercially made bodice stuck under the figure, and it didn't fit at the back. This was made to fit. You can see the fabric underneath, but a lot of wax on top, tooled. It's beautifully, beautifully fitted to the back. Here is that Morgan drawing again. You have eyes. Which plaster, which version more closely records the décolleté from Degas' own drawing? I mean, here's something from Degas' own hand. That is much closer than this. This bodice is much higher. It didn't, it was a commercially made bodice applied later. It didn't fit. This one fit beautifully, and it goes along with Degas' own drawing. We talked about the legs. Right now, there's no fabric on the wax in the National Gallery on the legs. There are just some pinches at the knee of the original wax to kind of make it look like some fabric leggings, so it's kind of faux. Well, as Meredith Montague determined when it was up in Boston, the plaster that we sent her has real muslin fabric on the legs. This took a lot of time to, after you model your figure, to apply real muslin to the legs, tool it, add a little wax to hold it on. I mean, it's kind of crunched up in the crotch area, but it's real muslin leggings. And when you think about it, that's my next slide. Yeah, when you think about it, in 1881, if you have a real wig at the back, real hair ribbons, real bodice, real tutu, real shoes, wouldn't Degas, the perfectionist, go to the trouble of having real fabric on the legs? And this plaster records real fabric on the legs, which is why the legs are thicker, as one would kind of expect. Here's a drawing by Degas. It's in a private collection. But you see this line here, that kind of sinuous line? This is a drawing by Degas, considered one of the studies for the little dancer. You see the weight is on the front foot. You can see the kind of bulge right there, not on the back foot as it is today. And this beautiful line there, again, more visual documentation. I love about art history. And the plaster records a different wig at the back. It's been determined, actually Carol Cohn pointed this out, the plaster records a wig. It's covered with kind of a hairnet that's going down the figure. So there could have been real hair visible underneath this wig stuck in the back. And this could be the dark and woolly horsehair wig that Heisman and Havmeyer recorded up until 1903. Degas, the hair deteriorated, maybe the hairnet deteriorated. He talked about the black and wax. So whatever reason, he pulled it out, big hole, cut wires, stuck in a different wig. It was blonde, didn't match the hair and top, so he covered this all with brown wax, and that's another change. And again, I'm reminding you of the hole in the back of the head with the cut wires. Mystery number 4, the central armature. Elliot Goldfinger, who's author of Human Anatomy for Artists, published by Oxford University Press, and a figurative artist himself, did this overlay where he took a photograph of the plaster, a photograph of Bard bronze, and then overlaid it, onto the X-ray of the wax in the National Gallery. And you can see the bronze is red, the plaster is black, and the plaster is right kind of in the middle of the armature, as you would expect. I mean, Degas was not an amateur sculptor. He knew to place his armature in the middle. But later, he took some wax off here, stuck it over there, maybe took some wax, stuck it on the back of her head. The other thing I never noticed until Elliot did this overlay is that the plaster, the shoulders are lower than on the wax today, or the barred bronzes. I went up to Boston, and thanks to Henry Lee, the head of conservation at the Fogg Art Museum, we did all these measurements of the Heberg bronze in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and indeed it turns out that by comparing measurements, the plaster's shoulders are lower. I thought, well, he must have added wax at some point. 2010, the new National Gallery book comes out. I read, Daphne and Barbara and Shelley Sermon determined that at some point Degas added to the height of the shoulders by adding numerous layers of new wax. Ta-da! I mean, it was kind of nice to, the other thing you can see here is the tilt of the head. The plaster is slightly lower than the wax today. In 2010, after Elliot made this, and after it was like, well, he must have tipped the head back at some point, the National Gallery book comes out. At some point, Degas tilted the head further back. You can see a crack in the neck, and there's a nose underneath it. Anyway, they confirmed that at some point, Degas tipped back the head at some point. Here is the Morgan Library, drawing again with a deep décolleté. You can see how high it is in the bronze. And notice this outline. This is Degas' own drawing. See the outline of her right hip? That corresponds to the plaster. It doesn't correspond to the wax today. The right shoulder on the plaster is properly inserted, not kind of off centers here. One thing, notice this little indentation. There are a lot of details that got lost over time. One of them, these beautiful eyelids. This is, frankly, one of the first things that attracted me to this, is incredible eyelids. Typically, if you make a plaster negative molds from a wax, and you're going into something as thin as eyelids, when you take that mold off, you often lose some fine little details. And on the wax today, those long eyelids are gone. And this detail here, kind of an indentation of the ribbon in her hair, that's now gone on the wax. This is a drawing by Degas, the Musée d'Orsay, considered along with the Morgan drawing to be one of the later ones. Note, level shoulders, level hips, very thick legs. And also see here this kind of indentation where her hair is going this way and then that way, this ribbon at the top. That, as I just pointed out, was recorded by the plaster. This is actually a drawing of his model. And look at these collarbones. I mean, Degas was making a point of, and look, they're on the plaster, and they've just now been kind of lost on the wax today. He was concerned about being blackened, soot. I mean, maybe he just kind of scraped off this blackened wax and just lost details. But here they are in those beautiful eyelids on the plaster. One thing that he didn't change, and nobody's ever noticed this, I think I noticed it on a bronze first, that one ear, actually, let me back up a second. This is kind of unusual because see her ear there? It's kind of upright, and that ear is further back. They're both her right ear, but on the plaster, her proper right ear is kind of at a 30-degree angle on the wax and the plaster, but her left ear is kind of a 45-degree angle on both the plaster and the wax. It's something Degas did not change, and it's kind of a fun little detail that he survived on both of them. So now the big mystery. Why did they consider it so revolutionary? It's a good thing I've made all these notes. There we go. Again, the key difference is this level shoulders, level hips, weight on both feet. This is the contrapposto pose. And it's the pose. I mean, yes, a different bodice, but the pose is really the key difference. To understand how revolutionary this is, you have to put yourself back to 1881. And what is the kind of art you see around you? You see things like this great Bouguereau, Dance of the Bacchantes, with all these figures in motion, hand gestures, facial expressions, elegant contrapposto poses. Rodin, the same thing, the St. John the Baptist walking. I mean, the hand gesture, the facial expression, this motion. This is what art was all about in 18. I mean, it's just used to it in art schools. You'd pose the model in a contrapposto pose. And remember from Art 101 when you were in college, that big divide of 480 BC. Prior to that, Egyptian, archaic Greek sculpture, level shoulders, level hips, very little hand gestures, hardly any emotion. The feet, you know, they were the only asymmetrical part, but the weight was on both feet, weight on both feet. Then the Greeks invented the contrapposto pose, and, you know, with Praxiteles and others, the weight is on one foot. Now we start to get hand gestures and facial expression. And this is a huge divide in art history, this big, and this kind of pose lasted for 1,500 years. There was a brief moment around 1200 with Chuck Little is here. He knows this. In the Middle Ages, when you know, there was some, you know, again back to these rigid poses. But basically, this was kind of it for, you know, 1,500 years. And the plaster is on this side: level shoulders, level hips, weight on both feet. And if you think of the plaster covered with a tutu down to her knees, which it was, the original wax, it would be symmetrical all the way down to there, in just the feet, just as there is in Egyptian sculpture. This is, you know, his was on that side of this great divide, whereas the wax today was on the other side. Jean Boggs talks about late in life, Degas constantly went from equilibrium to disequilibrium. And this is kind of equilibrium to disequilibrium, you know, with a more flowing contrapposto pose. And the Musée d'Orsay is the biggest collection of French sculpture found anywhere. You see the Carpeaux, it's women dancing in motion, the Fremier, the St. Michael, both of these before Degas' dance. This is what people were used to. And imagine going in an exhibition and you see this stiff figure, no hand gestures, or hardly, you know, those aren't hand gestures, hardly an expression, and he locks it in a vitrine. He put it in a vitrine. Waxes were shown at that time without a vitrine. People would walk right. This is Paris in 1881. They weren't going to worry about somebody touching the tutu. Why did he put it in a vitrine? Well, as Jonathan Spike points out, it acted like a viewfinder. It focused your attention on left side, right side. These are mirror images of one another, particularly if there was a tutu there. You know, these are exactly identical, right and left. The back, the front. These are these, I call them vitrine views. Front, back, left, right. And how different it was from those other things. I mean, this is finally, you can kind of understand what Heisman was talking about, this new kind of sculpture. And Nina de Villar, there's something new here. Here's a photograph. There are, 7 people with contrapposto naturalistic poses. One guy in the middle is giving himself a 4-sided pose, you know, symmetrical pose facing the side, and that is Degas. So, you know, he is, Walter Friedlander wrote this great book, Mannerism and Anti-Mannerism in Western Art. You could kind of talk about this as contrapposto and anti-contrapposto. You can see Degas right there, anti-contrapposto. There's another photograph of him standing there like this, with everybody else like this, and he's, you know, rigid. Now, my chapter 2 of my book, I go through all poses, frontal iconic poses before Degas' Little Dancer, and typically they were for a religious figure, like Fra Angelico's Christ, or Puvis de Chavannes, St. John the Baptist. That was the kind of thing people were used to, those poses. Or royalty, there's Queen Elizabeth I, there's Henry VIII, copy after Holbein, you know, level shoulders, looking straight ahead, you know, the feet firmly planted, you know, these iconic poses. And here's Anne of Cleves, you know, once Queen of England, you know, with frontal pose, whatever. And this is by Degas. He copied that from the Holbein. So we know, obviously, Degas was such a sophisticated man. I mean, he obviously knew about this tradition. He was also considered to be more scientific. Lebrun in the 17th century, you do frontal, side poses. It's more scientific. Even today, wanted posters, frontal, side. Messerschmitt in the 18th century, he considered his to be scientific studies. We love this today because they're these kind of 4-sided poses, and people actually called his works kind of Egyptian. But for secular figures, I kept looking and looking for secular figures. Before Degas' Little Dancer, they were given a 4-sided pose. I found a Millet, a few Daumiers, but this key one was a Cézanne, the Bathers, from 1876, 77, right before Degas began working as a little dancer. Level shoulders, level hips, and it's just a male nude, a male bather, kind of weight, kind of equally. And guess who did a drawing of it? This is by Degas. It's nice because I thought about this, and then I found the drawing. And, you know, this has been recorded. It's Degas' drawing from memory of Cézanne's figure. This has never been connected to the Little Dancer before because we didn't, you know, we were used to the contrapposto pose. After, my chapter 3 is all after Degas exhibited his Little Dancer the interesting thing is there was suddenly a flourish in Paris of people giving these kind of iconic poses to secular figures. Very, very rare, except for that Cézanne, one Millet, very, very rare before Degas' Little Dancer. But after Degas' Little Dancer, chapter 3 is filled with Tissot, Bouguereau. One prime example, this Whistler of the Chelsea Girl, which happened to hang in my office for twice in my life, was rather a treat. It's now in the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas. I thought, aha, here's an example of Whistler, who's so close to Degas, level shoulders, level hips, kind of equal weight, giving on a kind of an iconic pose to a Chelsea girl. A Chelsea girl, somebody asked for an apple, sell you an apple, and then she'd pick your pocket. I mean, it's kind of like the operette that Degas elevated with his four-sided pose. Whistler elevated his Chelsea girl. And it's a big, big painting. I mean, that's practically the size it is in the original. Now, people have talked about this. It's a Henry VIII pose. Yes, like a king, like a royal pose. And they talked about how kind of a royal pose. But the more immediate influence was probably Degas. But I thought, well, Whistler was in London. Degas' Little Dancer was in Paris. And then I read Ted Greff and found this reference where Blanche records that in 1881, Whistler came to Paris, was hooped and hollered around Degas' Little Dancer when it was shown in his vitrine. He got it. He went back to London and he elevated a Chelsea girl with the same kind of idea. Manet, after Degas' Little Dancer was shown in April, Manet was not that well. He went to Versailles, stayed with a friend, and he painted, just as a gift, a portrait of his son, Henry Bernstein. Gives him level shoulders, level hips, kind of no hand gestures, feet, kind of, you know. Prior to that, like the Pfeiffer from 1866, I mean, typically before that, Manet was always, you know, giving people naturalistic contrapuntal poses. But after he saw Degas' Little Dancer, he experimented with this. Both of these works, the Manet and the Whistler, were uncommissioned works. They were just painted. Manet did it gave it as a gift to his friend who let him stay with him. And Whistler just did that for himself. And when you look at there's some influence here. But it's not Manet influencing Whistler or Whistler influencing Manet. It's Degas influencing, I propose, both of them. Manet, again, the bar at the Folies Bergère. Here's his sketch. Naturalistic pose. She's looking off to one side, not looking straight ahead. When they x-ray, this is the famous painting in the Courtauld in London. When they x-rayed this painting, they found underneath was this painting. I mean, it had been drawn in. So obviously, Manet was very happy with this. He did it on this is a small sketch. He did it on a big scale. Kind of explains why this figure is off center. But his original idea for this figure was to have it looking off to one side. When did he change it? In the late 1881 and early 1882, after seeing Degas' Little Dancer. He got it. The buttons are right down the middle. The figure's right in the middle of the canvas. Robert Rosenblum talks about like a Madonna, you know, this iconic figure, giving a pose that should be for a king or Christ or Madonna to a barmaid, just as Degas gave that kind of pose to an operette and Whistler gave that pose to a Chelsea girl. And up until now, people said, well, it's the Egyptian revival. Well, the Egyptian revival had been going on since the 18th century. I mean, it wasn't anything new suddenly in 1881. Seurat, Robert Herbert did a great exhibition of Seurat's drawings at the Metropolitan Museum, well, Seurat in general. And he points out in his catalog that prior to 1881, Seurat's drawings were typically contrapposto. After 1881, he started doing these frontal, you know, front, side, vitrine views. And of course, the great 1884, 1886, Le Grand Jatte. I mean, all these figures with, you know, side poses, frontal poses. I mean, what's interesting is that Alfred Barr concluded, I guess it was in the 1930s, that modern art began in Paris in the 1880s, in large part because there were suddenly these side and frontal poses that flattened space. Who was at the beginning of this? I propose it was that genius, Degas. Here's Seurat only did 2 drawings of ballet dancers. This is one of them. Here's a contrapposto pose, very naturalistic, totally symmetrical, and it's a ballet dancer. I mean, you know, kind of a tribute to Degas. I mean, he got it. This is his early drawings at the Metropolitan Museum for his famous painting of posers. I mean, you put her hands behind the back, and you practically have move her legs a little bit, you practically have Degas' Little Dancer. Suddenly, Sargent, after seeing Degas' Little Dancer, his friend, Edward Watt, he did a painting of his 4 daughters. Frontal view, complete. This is square canvas, exactly in the middle of the canvas, like Manet did. Side view, front view, no hand gestures. This is like one side and frontal of Degas' vitrine. She's almost posed like Degas' Little Dancer. The only one turning to one side is the little girl at the bottom, but even below her neck, she's kind of a symmetrical pose. A few years later, Sargent does a great, Elizabeth Gardner at the Gardner Museum. Henry James said it looks like a Byzantine Madonna. I mean, he gives her this, pose and halo and everything. I mean, he really pulls out all the stop. What they're doing is giving religious iconography and putting it into secular figures. Religious iconography elevated the king or the saint or whatever, and now they're elevating Elizabeth Gardner. By 1887, Van Gogh never saw Degas' Little Dancer. I mean, by that time, it had been kind of, other examples by Renoir, by Tissot, by Bouguereau. I mean, chapter 3 is filled with these examples of people giving these poses in the 1880s and a little bit later. But now Van Gogh is giving it to a lowly paint pusher or whatever, giving frontal, level shoulders. And it just, was, but now he wasn't considering this as an unworthy that he was elevating. Van Gogh considered this man, Pierre Tanguy, to be absolutely worthy of such a distinguished pose. Later, have people like Munch. You find these in a lot of Munch's paintings, this kind of symmetrical poses. In America, Albert Thayer, My Children in the Smithsonian. And now I end chapter 3 by talking about Picasso. Young Picasso, like Degas in his early in his life, he did a lot of paintings and drawings with people, frontal, symmetrical, kind of culminating in his Little Dancer. Picasso, early in his life, did drawings and even this sculpture of figures with level shoulders, level hips, absolutely symmetrical. And of course, he's looking at African art. And there's something that this has in similar with Degas. I mean, both Degas and Picasso are obviously geniuses. The Demoiselle d'Avignon, the Museum of Modern Art. When I was at the Institute, Professor Colin Eiser had got to read George Kubler's The Shape of Time, plowed through this book. But I remember he talked about if you're inventing, I mean, this is really what people consider the foundation of modern art. If you're inventing a new art form, you must go back, a new formal combinations, you must go back to you create a recognizable variation upon the dominant memory image. I'll say that again. A recognizable variation upon the dominant memory image. And for Picasso, the dominant memory image is obviously African art. And he gives you hints with these 2 African masks that the eyes, or whatever. He's saying, this is what, I'm going back to African art. I'm taking it, I'm digesting it, I'm making it my own, and I'm creating this. But hint, this is the memory image that I'm taking from. With Degas, with his Little Dancer, early on, there's kind of mystery. Mary Cassatt referred to Degas' Little Dancer, before she saw the reworked one, as being very Egyptian. Mrs. Havemeyer talked about how Egyptian it was. Richard Kendall wrote a whole essay about how doll-like, dolls are stiff, and Egyptian it was, and how Durante, his dear friend, was so enamored with Egyptian art. And as I said, the level shoulders, level hips, that's kind of an Egyptian aesthetic. And what does he do? Like Picasso's African mask, he gives you this clear hint in the back of his sculpture, which you find, this is in the Metropolitan Museum, this is in Egyptian classical figures in the Brooklyn Museum. I mean, these you see quite often on the back of Egyptian figures. It's the hint. Now for 4 minutes, I'm going to whip you through chapter 4. I could kind of be called contrapposto and anti-contrapposto in modern art. I mean, the century begins with a lot of Maio, Brancusi, Modigliani, rebelling against the contrapposto, suddenly doing these symmetrical figures. You have elevating a lowly object. I mean, this is about a lowly object as you can get. It actually is absolutely symmetrical. Of course, Duchamp, elevating it. But Grant Wood, the difference, this is a frontal pose. This is an iconic pose. It's a big difference, just looking off to one slide slightly. This is just so much more powerful. But here's Grant Wood elevating a farmer, who's actually a dentist, with this kind of pose. But what you'll discover is really, up until World War II, the dominant, was contrapposto. It was all about motion from Thomas Hart Benton to Picasso. It was movement in works of art. But after World War II, you suddenly get a whole flourish. Barnett Newman, Albers, in New York City, Rothko, like Paris in the 1880s. You suddenly have this flourish of, now they're not figures, there are some figures, but they're abstract paintings, but symmetrical. Johns, Frank Stella, Chuck Close, Alfred Leslie. If you look at the course of modern art as going towards abstraction, these are a throwback. But if you look at the course of art as going kind of icons and symmetrical figures, these are falling right after Stella and the others. But it's figurative. Dan Flavin, Donald Judd. You've got Warhol elevating a soup can with its frontal pose. You've got Oldenburg with his symmetrical clothespin. Talk about elevating a common day object. This clothespin is 45 feet high in Philadelphia. You have Giacometti, like Degas. He put his symmetrical figure in a vitrine to kind of emphasize the pose. And funny of Jeff Koons elevating a Hoover vacuum cleaner with the vitrine, symmetrical figures. Internationally, you've got Anthony Gormley and Kiki Smith. This is called the Virgin Mother in these symmetrical poses. You said now we're so used to these things. Part of the point of this is that we're now so used to this that it didn't seem so shocking. But imagine you were just used to what you see now in the Musée d'Orsay, the sculpture court. If that's what you were used to, suddenly seeing a figure like that, it's a formation of a new art. I'm not saying these people saw Degas. I'm saying that's kind of ideas caped on in the 20th century. And it goes back into New York in the more recent time. Patty Watwood, Flora, Jacob Collins with his figure study, and Michael Glass with his 5 orphans. All 3 of these artists are here today. And you get, finally I'll end up with China, with Lou Li, who did this work on the left, Girl and Piggy. One of the reasons we kind of appreciate Chinese art today is it's so symmetrical and seems kind of modern. And you have them like Wang Guangyang with his Cold War preparedness. Of course, in Chinese art, you have this tradition of the ancestor portrait, the tomb figures, all with symmetrical poses. And the last one I'm going to show you is this work that's called Monument, Stone of Hope by Li Kanxiu. It's in the Monument to Martin Luther King. And what's so interesting, in the 19th century, the 2 works of art that got the most criticism were in 1810, Ang painted a painting of Napoleon looking like a Byzantine emperor with this symmetrical pose. A face very looking at, and he was criticized because he suddenly took the man of the people, our little corporal, up and made him a Byzantine emperor, and he was severely criticized. The other work of art was Degas with his opera rat, Little Dancer, elevating this opera rat. This is much more blasphemous than Manet showing a prostitute. The prostitute that Manet depicted was in her proper position in life. Degas was elevating this opera rat, up into the realm of kings and royalty with that kind of pose. When the severest criticism of this monument is people saying they're giving Martin Luther King a boss man pose. And you can see the level shoulders, level hips, and not a vitrine, but this kind of surrounds it. And indeed, boy, he seems like, and this is what they're saying, Martin Luther King is not this, boss man pose. So basically, poses matter. Thank you.